Hello, curious minds. I'm the Apex Storyteller, here to share a tale to keep you company tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now get comfortable and let's dive in. The forest was her sanctuary. Amelia had lived there for years, nestled in a cabin surrounded by towering pines and the whispers of the wind. She thought she knew every sound, every shadow. But lately something was wrong. The birds stopped singing when she walked by. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. And at night, she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling her cabin, stopping just outside her window. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Who, or what, was watching her? And why couldn't she escape the feeling that she wasn't alone? Amelia had always loved the forest. It was where her parents had built the small cabin decades ago, long before she was born. They had told her stories of how the trees seemed alive, protecting them from the outside world. When they passed away in a tragic accident 5 years ago, Amelia stayed, finding solace in the woods. It was her escape from the chaos of the world, her cocoon of safety. But things began to change a few weeks ago. Subtle things at first. The rhythmic chirping of crickets seemed to vanish at night. The deer that used to graze in the clearing near her home no longer appeared. Even the wind felt different, no longer a soft caress but something sharp, almost like whispers brushing past her ears. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest bathed in twilight, Amelia sat on her porch with a mug of tea. The air was heavy, unusually still. She found herself staring into the line of trees, where the shadows grew darker by the second. She couldn't explain why, but she felt watched. A rustle broke the silence. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She set her mug down and peered into the gloom. Probably just a squirrel, she muttered to herself, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into her chest. Then came the sound, faint but distinct, of footsteps crunching on dry leaves. They were slow, deliberate. Not the erratic scurry of an animal, but human. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky but firm. No response. Grabbing the flashlight from beside the door, she stepped off the porch and pointed the beam toward the noise. The light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. Her breath hitched when she saw a figure, a fleeting shadow darting between the trunks. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The forest swallowed her words. After a few tense moments, she turned back toward the cabin, deciding it was better to lock herself and then confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. But as she climbed the steps, she froze. There on her porch was a single red ribbon. She hadn't seen it when she stepped out. It hadn't been there. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It was tied into a neat bow, the kind a child might make. But there were no children anywhere near her cabin. The nearest neighbor was a mile away and they didn't have kids. That night she barely slept. She bolted the doors and windows and left every light on. The footsteps didn't return, but she swore she heard faint whispers outside, words she couldn't understand. The next morning, Amelia decided to shake off the strange events. It was likely a prank, she told herself. Someone messing with her because they knew she lived alone. Still, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. As she went about her day, she noticed more oddities. The path she always took to gather firewood was littered with small hand-carved wooden dolls, each one missing an eye. She found a mirror, cracked and fogged, hanging from a tree branch. And then there was the sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to follow her no matter where she went. By the time evening rolled around, she was on edge. She locked up the cabin again, pulling the heavy curtains shut. But as the night dragged on, the whispers grew louder. This time they weren't outside. They were coming from within the cabin. Amelia clutched a kitchen knife and tiptoed through the house, her heart pounding like a drum. "Who's in here?" she called out, her voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Then came a single knock on her bedroom door. She froze, every muscle in her body stiff with fear. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, she reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling. When she flung the door open, the room was empty. But on her bed was another ribbon, black this time, tied into a bough. Beneath it was a small, handwritten note. It read, "The forest doesn't want you here." Amelia stared at the note, her mind racing. Was someone in the cabin? How did they get in? She checked every lock, every window, but there was no sign of forced entry. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. They didn't come from one direction anymore. They surrounded her, echoing through the walls like the voices of the forest itself. And then the lights went out. Amelia screamed, clutching the knife tighter. She fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, the weak beam barely piercing the oppressive darkness. The whispers were everywhere now, rising to a deafening crescendo. "Get out," they hissed in unison. In that moment, Amelia realized the forest wasn't her sanctuary anymore. It was her prison. Amelia didn't remember falling asleep. When she opened her eyes, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, but it didn't feel warm. The light seemed pale, almost sickly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to touch her cabin. The memory of the whispers and the note sent shivers down her spine. She bolted upright, clutching the black ribbon she had fallen asleep holding. The note lay crumpled on the floor where she had thrown it in fear the night before. She unfolded it again, staring at the eerie message, "The forest doesn't want you here." Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of it. Was someone trying to scare her into leaving? So what? The cabin had been her home for years and no one had ever bothered her before. She decided to call the sheriff, even though she knew it would take him at least an hour to get there. The forest wasn't exactly bustling with law enforcement, but when she picked up her phone, the line was dead. Her stomach tightened. The phone had worked perfectly yesterday. She grabbed her coat and decided to drive into town. Whatever was happening, she wasn't going to face it alone. As she stepped outside, the forest greeted her with an unsettling silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. She hurried to her car, trying to shake off the feeling that eyes were watching her from the shadows. But when she reached the driveway, her blood ran cold. The tires were slashed. All four of them. Deep, jagged cuts, as if made by something far sharper than a knife. Her car wasn't going anywhere. Amelia's hands trembled as she backed away from the vehicle. She glanced toward the tree line, where the shadows seemed thicker than usual, almost alive. She thought she saw movement, just a flicker like a shape retreating into the darkness, but it was gone before she could be sure. She had no choice. She would have to walk to town. The main road was a few miles away, but she couldn't stay here, not with the growing sense of dread that hung over her like a storm cloud. Grabbing a flashlight and a backpack filled with essentials, Amelia set off down the narrow dirt path that led toward the main road. The forest felt different during the day, less menacing but no less strange. She noticed things she hadn't seen before: claw marks on tree trunks, scattered piles of feathers, and a faint metallic smell in the air. About half a mile into her walk, she heard it again: footsteps. This time they were closer, following her at an almost leisurely pace. She stopped abruptly, spinning around. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. The footsteps stopped. Her pulse raced as she scanned the path behind her. Nothing. No movement, no shadows, just the same eerie stillness. But as she turned back to continue walking, she saw something that made her stomach lurch. Another ribbon. Red this time, tied neatly to a low-hanging branch. She didn't touch it. She didn't even want to get close to it. Instead, she quickened her pace, her heart pounding with every step. The footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop when she turned around. They grew faster, matching her own frantic pace. Panic set in as she broke into a sprint, the sound of pursuit growing louder and more relentless. She didn't dare look back. The main road was just ahead. She could see it through the thinning trees, the promise of escape almost within reach. But as she burst onto the gravel, gasping for air, she realized something was wrong. The road was empty. Completely empty. No cars, no distant sounds of civilization. Nothing. It was as if the world beyond the forest had vanished. Amelia doubled over, trying to catch her breath, when she noticed it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her. "Stay away," she screamed, backing away toward the road. But the figure didn't move. Instead, it raised its arms slowly, pointing toward her cabin. Amelia didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran back the way she had come, her legs screaming in protest. She didn't know why she was running back to the cabin. It felt like the worst possible idea, but something inside her compelled her to return. When she finally reached the cabin, her body was trembling, her lungs burning. She slammed the door shut behind her and locked it, her fingers fumbling with the latch. She pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath. Then she heard it. A faint knock on the window. She froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes widening in horror. There, pressed against the glass, was a hand. It wasn't human. The fingers were long and thin, the nails sharp and blackened. And behind it, two glowing eyes stared back at her. Amelia's breath hitched as her wide eyes locked with the glowing ones outside the window. The hand remained there, unmoving, as if testing her resolve. She didn't scream. Fear had stolen her voice. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but to where? The forest? The very thing she was trying to escape? The knocking stopped. Amelia blinked, unsure if she had imagined it. Slowly, she crept closer to the window, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to convince herself that it was just a trick of her imagination, a shadow cast by her fear. But as she reached the window, the glass fogged up. A single word appeared, scrawled into the condensation. Remember? Her stomach twisted. Remember what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The glass cleared and the glowing eyes were gone. The forest outside was still again, its trees standing like silent sentinels. But the weight of the word lingered, heavy and foreboding. She stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. The black ribbon, the slashed tires, the red ribbon on the path, the eyes. What did it all mean? What was she supposed to remember? Her knees gave way and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head. Fragments of memories flickered in her mind, flashes of the past she didn't want to revisit. A child's laughter, a blood-curdling scream. The sound of her name whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. Amelia bolted upright. The whispers, they were back. But this time they weren't outside. They were inside the cabin. She scanned the room, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to come from every direction at once, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel their intent. They weren't just random noises, they were deliberate, insistent. "Leave me alone," she cried, covering her ears. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then a low creak broke through the stillness. Amelia's head snapped toward the source, the mirror hanging on the wall. The glass wasn't reflecting her cabin anymore. Instead, it showed a dense forest shrouded in fog. The trees in the reflection swayed violently, though the air around her cabin was still. She approached the mirror cautiously, her hand reaching out as if to confirm it was real. Her fingers brushed the surface, and the glass rippled like water. She yanked her hand back, heart pounding. The reflection shifted, and a figure appeared in the forest. It was a girl, young and pale, her long black hair matted and unkempt. She stood barefoot in the dirt, staring at Amelia through the glass. Who are you?" Amelia whispered. The girl tilted her head, her expression blank. Then her lips moved, forming a single chilling sentence. "You promised to protect me." Amelia stumbled back. "What? I don't know you." The girl's face twisted into something dark, her features contorting in anger. The forest behind her erupted into chaos. The trees bent and snapped as though a storm was tearing through them. The girl stepped closer, her pale hand pressing against the other side of the mirror. Amelia felt an icy chill radiate from the glass, spreading through the room. The cabin's walls groaned as if under immense pressure. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. The girl's voice echoed through the cabin, low and menacing. "You left me here. You forgot me." Amelia shook her head violently. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please stop this." The girl's eyes narrowed and the reflection began to crack. Splinters of glass snaked across the surface of the mirror, each crack accompanied by a sharp, echoing sound. Amelia turned to run, but the door wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Behind her, the mirror shattered, sending shards flying across the room. When she turned back, the girl was gone. In her place was a black ribbon, coiled like a serpent on the floor. Amelia stared at it, her chest heaving. She didn't want to touch it, but she knew she had no choice. Trembling, she bent down and picked it up. The moment her fingers closed around it, a wave of memories crashed over her. She was a child, running through the forest with another girl. They were laughing, their hands intertwined. But then the laughter turned to screams. Amelia let go of the girl's hand and ran, leaving her behind. The memory dissolved, and Amelia found herself back in the cabin, the ribbon clenched tightly in her fist. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I didn't mean to leave you. I didn't mean to forget." The cabin groaned again, and the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't angry anymore, they sounded mournful, filled with sorrow. Amelia sank to the floor, clutching the ribbon to her chest. The forest had taken something from her, and now it wanted her to remember. But what? And what would happen when she did? Amelia woke to a suffocating darkness. The cabin's single lamp had extinguished, leaving her surrounded by an abyss so complete she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or shut. Her breath was shallow, every inhale sharp and strained as if the air itself had thickened. The ribbon was still clenched in her hand, damp from her sweaty palms. Something was wrong. She reached blindly for her flashlight, her trembling fingers fumbling over the wooden floor. When she finally found it and clicked it on, the narrow beam illuminated the room in jagged flashes as her hand shook. The cabin was eerily silent. Not a whisper, not a creak. Even the usual nocturnal calls of the forest were absent. It was as though the world had been muted. But then she noticed something. The door to the cabin was open. She stared at it, the beam of her flashlight frozen on the jagged edge of the wooden frame. She was sure she had locked it before she went to sleep. Slowly, cautiously, she stood, her movements sluggish and hesitant. The night outside the cabin loomed like a black hole, an impenetrable void that seemed to pulse with a silent menace. Her first step toward the door was hesitant, her bare foot brushing against something cold and slick. She froze, the beam of her flashlight snapping downward. A trail. Thin streaks of wet, dark fluid led from the ribbon in her hand to the open doorway. Her stomach churned as the realization hit her. The forest was calling her again. Amelia's instinct screamed at her to retreat, to lock herself inside and wait for daylight. But the pull was undeniable, an invisible force tugging at her chest, urging her forward. Against her better judgment, she stepped out into the night. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but it wasn't much comfort. The forest was unnaturally still. Even the trees seemed lifeless, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was cold, biting at her skin as she followed the trail deeper into the woods. The further she walked, the stranger things became. The trail wasn't just a random path. It was deliberate, almost precise, weaving through the trees in an unnatural pattern. At times, the streaks of fluid seemed to glow faintly, guiding her like a macabre breadcrumb trail. And then she saw it. A figure stood ahead, shrouded in shadow. It wasn't the girl from the mirror, this was something else. Its shape was vaguely human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadow didn't move, but Amelia could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating, locking onto her from the darkness. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The shadow tilted its head further, the motion slow and deliberate, as if it were studying her. Then it stepped back into the trees, disappearing from view. Amelia's heart raced as she debated whether to follow. Every rational thought screamed at her to turn around, but the pull was stronger than ever. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a compulsion, a need to uncover whatever dark truth lay hidden in these woods. She pressed on, her steps faltering but determined. The trail led her to a clearing, the trees parting to reveal an ancient stone well. The structure was covered in moss, its surface cracked and weathered, but it exuded an ominous energy that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct, each voice overlapping with the next in a chaotic chorus. Amelia covered her ears, but it was useless. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside her mind, burrowing deep and unrelenting. "Remember," they said. The ribbon in her hand began to burn, its once soft fabric now rigid and hot. She dropped it instinctively and it fell to the ground, landing near the well. The whispers ceased. Amelia approached the well cautiously, peering over the edge. The darkness within seemed endless, a gaping maw that threatened to swallow her whole. But then she saw something, a faint light, deep within the abyss. The light flickered and pulsed, growing brighter as she stared. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic. She leaned closer, unable to look away, her heart pounding as the light began to take shape. It was a face. Pale and distorted, the face of a girl stared back at her from the depths. It was the same girl from the mirror, but her features were warped, her eyes hollow and lifeless. "You left me here," the girl's voice echoed, low and guttural. Amelia stumbled back, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do. The memories were still fragmented, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't fit together. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice breaking. The girl's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her eyes narrowing. "You always mean to, Amelia. That's the problem." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the forest erupting into chaos. Trees groaned and splintered, their branches whipping violently. The whispers returned, louder and more aggressive, their voices blending into an almost unbearable roar. Amelia tried to run, but the shadow from before was back, blocking her path. It loomed over her, its form shifting and writhing as though it were made of smoke. "Stop!" she screamed, falling to her knees. The shadow didn't move. Instead, it extended a long claw-like hand toward her, pointing at the well. Amelia turned back, her eyes locking onto the ribbon lying near the edge. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to take it. Trembling, she crawled toward it, her hands shaking as she reached out. The moment her fingers closed around the ribbon, the world went silent. And then she remembered. Her past, her actions, her betrayal, all of it came flooding back, vivid and undeniable. The girl in the well wasn't a stranger. She was someone Amelia had once loved, someone she had abandoned in her darkest hour. "I'm sorry," Amelia whispered, tears streaming down her face. The shadow loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "Sorry isn't enough," it hissed. The ground beneath her crumbled, and the well yawned open, pulling her toward its depths. She screamed, clutching the ribbon tightly as the darkness swallowed her whole. The world was gone. All that remained was darkness, a suffocating, endless void that pressed against Amelia's skin like wet, heavy fabric. She was falling, but there was no sense of speed, no wind rushing past her. It was as though time itself had frozen. And then, with a jarring thud, she hit something solid. Amelia lay still for a moment, gasping for breath. The ground beneath her was damp and cold, and the air smelled of earth and decay. Slowly, she pushed herself up, the flashlight in her hand flickering weakly. Its narrow beam revealed rough stone walls, slick with moisture, that curved upward into the darkness. She was inside the well. But this wasn't just a well anymore. The space expanded before her, the walls widening into a cavernous chamber that seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows danced along the uneven surface, twisting and writhing like living things. "Amelia?" The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was enough to make her heart stop. She spun around, the flashlight beam trembling as she tried to locate the source. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The only response was the echo of her own words, bouncing back at her from the cavernous space. But she wasn't alone. She could feel it, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the unmistakable presence of something watching her. The ribbon in her hand began to tighten, the fabric curling around her fingers like a snake. She yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. The harder she pulled, the tighter it became, biting into her skin until it drew blood. "Let go," she screamed, her voice ringing out in the emptiness. The ribbon released her abruptly, dropping to the ground in a lifeless heap. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, it began to move again, slithering across the floor like it had a mind of its own. It stopped a few feet ahead, coiling into a circle. From the center of the circle, the ground began to crack. Slowly, methodically, the crack spread outward, revealing a deep fissure. From the darkness of the fissure, a hand emerged. It was pale and thin, the skin stretched tightly over bone, with fingers that were impossibly long. Another hand followed, and then a head, its face shrouded in shadows. Amelia stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wanted to run, to turn and flee, but her legs refused to move. The figure pulled itself out of the fissure, rising to its full height. Its face was partially obscured by matted hair, but its eyes, those hollow black pits, locked onto hers with an intensity that froze her in place. "Why did you leave me?" the figure rasped, its voice low and guttural. I don't know." Amelia stammered, tears streaming down her face. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. With each step, the cavern grew darker, the flashlight beam dimming until it barely illuminated anything at all. "You knew," it hissed. "You always knew." Memories surged forward, unbidden and overwhelming. A child's laughter, a girl's voice calling her name, a face blurred by time and guilt. Amelia clutched her head, the memories battering her mind like a storm. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. "I didn't mean to leave you." The figure paused, its head tilting slightly. "Didn't mean to," it echoed, its voice dripping with venom. "Or didn't care enough to stay?" The words hit her like a blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The cavern began to change. The walls shifted, the shadows deepening and twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces emerged from the darkness, distorted, anguished faces that seemed to scream silently. The ground beneath her feet grew unsteady, the fissure widening as if to swallow her whole. But the figure didn't move. It stood there watching her, its hollow eyes burning into her soul. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure extended a hand, its fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. "Come," it said simply. Amelia hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. The cavern stretched endlessly in every direction, the shadows pressing in closer. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out to take the figure's hand, the ground beneath her gave way. She fell, plunging into the darkness once more. But this time, the darkness wasn't empty. It was alive. Hands clawed at her from all sides, grasping and pulling, their touch cold and unrelenting. Whispers filled her ears, louder and more insistent, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Remember," they demanded. "Remember what you did." Amelia screamed, the sound swallowed by the void. She clawed at the darkness, trying to escape, but it was everywhere, suffocating and inescapable. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. She was lying on the cold stone floor again, her body trembling. The cavern was silent, the shadows still. But she wasn't alone. The figure was standing over her, its face now fully visible. It was the girl from the well. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow but filled with a burning intensity. "You can't escape," the girl said softly. "You never could." Amelia's vision blurred, the edges of the cavern fading into darkness. The last thing she saw was the girl's face, her twisted smile seared into her mind. And then there was nothing. When Amelia opened her eyes, she was back in her cabin. But something was wrong. The room was bathed in an eerie bluish light, and the walls seemed to shimmer as though they were alive. Her belongings were there, her books, her chair, the old photograph on the mantel, but they all looked distorted, like reflections in rippling water. She sat up, her body aching as though she'd run for miles. Her clothes were damp, the faint smell of the cavern lingering on her skin. Was it a dream? No, it was too vivid, too raw to be dismissed as a nightmare. The ribbon was still wrapped tightly around her wrist. It didn't make sense. She had left it behind, hadn't she? Amelia tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. The knot seemed to tighten the more she struggled, digging into her flesh until it burned. Her reflection in the mirror across the room caught her eye, and she froze. It wasn't her. The face staring back at her had her features. Her eyes, her hair, but it moved differently, the expression detached and emotionless. As she watched, the reflection smiled, a slow, unnerving grin that didn't reach its eyes. Amelia stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stayed still, watching her with that same unsettling smile. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The reflection tilted its head, as though considering her question. And then it spoke. "You brought me here." Amelia's knees buckled, and she grabbed onto the edge of the table to steady herself. "No," she murmured. I don't know what you're talking about." The reflection's smile widened, its teeth sharp and glinting in the bluish light. "You always knew. You just didn't want to admit it." A loud knock at the door made her jump, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a gunshot. She turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the timid knock of a visitor or the forceful bang of someone demanding entry. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and too perfectly spaced to be human. Amelia crept toward the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. "Don't," the reflection warned, its voice cold and hollow. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Why?" "Because they're waiting for you." Amelia's heart pounded as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. She turned back to the mirror, but her reflection was gone. The glass was empty, a void of swirling darkness. "Amelia?" The voice came from outside, muffled but unmistakable. It was her father's voice. Her breath caught. He had been dead for years, lost to the forest when she was a child. She had mourned him, longed for him, but now the sound of his voice filled her with a bone-deep dread. "Let me in, sweetheart," the voice called. "It's cold out here." Tears welled in her eyes. It sounded so real, so achingly familiar. But she couldn't ignore the warning in the reflection's words, or the unnatural chill that seemed to seep through the door. "Go away," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're not my father." The knocking stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. And then the door creaked open on its own. Amelia stumbled backward, her eyes fixed on the widening gap. Beyond the door was not the forest she knew, but an endless void of swirling mist and shadow. Shapes moved within the mist, shapes that were too twisted, too fragmented to be fully seen. A figure stepped through the doorway. It wore the tattered remains of her father's clothing, but its face was wrong. The features were blurred, as though someone had tried to recreate him from memory and failed. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its head snapping toward her with an audible crack. "You left me," it said, its voice layered with a deep, guttural undertone. Amelia backed away, her legs trembling. "You're not real," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as the thing before her. The figure tilted its head, its face twisting into an expression of mock sorrow. "I was real enough when you needed me, wasn't I? But when I needed you," it trailed off, the accusation hanging in the air like a noose. "Stop it," she screamed, clutching her head. Stop blaming me. I didn't. Her words faltered as the cabin began to shift. The walls groaned and stretched, the ceiling rising impossibly high. The furniture warped, growing larger and more menacing until it felt as though the room itself was alive, closing in on her. The ribbon tightened around her wrist again, pulling her arm upward as if trying to guide her. She resisted, tears streaming down her face, but the force was too strong. It led her to the center of the room, where the floorboards had split open to reveal a deep, black void. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't go. You can't make me." But the ribbon pulled harder, dragging her toward the edge. The figure watched, its hollow gaze filled with something like satisfaction. "You can't run from the truth, Amelia," it said, its voice echoing with 100 others. As she teetered on the edge, a memory surfaced, clearer than anything she'd experienced before. A little girl standing by the well. A fight. Screams. A shove. And then silence. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. "No," she choked out, the weight of the memory threatening to crush her. "It wasn't my fault. I didn't mean to." The figure stepped closer, its face inches from hers. "Didn't you?" With a final, wrenching pull, the ribbon yanked her into the void. She fell, the darkness swallowing her whole, the echoes of her screams fading into the silence. Amelia's fall seemed endless. She was consumed by the darkness, weightless and adrift in a void where time had no meaning. The cold was biting, like invisible hands tearing at her skin, pulling her deeper into the unknown. Her mind raced as flashes of her past flickered before her eyes, her childhood, the pain of loss, the fear that had always gnawed at her. But the memories grew distorted, warped by something dark and twisted, like a fever dream she couldn't wake from. Her body crashed against the ground, though she felt no pain. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. She opened her eyes, blinking against the oppressive darkness, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There was nothing. Just blackness, a void that stretched on forever. And then a whisper. "Amelia." Her name, soft and eerie, floated through the air, circling her like a cloud of smoke. She whipped her head around, but there was no one. The voice echoed again, but this time it was closer. "Amelia." She turned sharply, panic rising in her chest. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. A figure materialized out of the darkness, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the outline of its body was unmistakable. The tall, slender frame stood just at the edge of her vision, a silhouette that seemed to flicker and distort like a broken television. "Who are you?" Amelia's voice cracked, her heart thudding violently in her chest. "What do you want?" The figure took a slow step toward her, and as it did, the air grew colder, the darkness deeper. Every step it took sent ripples through the void, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around it. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice now clear, low, and reverberating in her bones. The words sank into her, heavy and suffocating. Amelia's mind raced. The voice, it sounded familiar but distorted. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real. You can't be." The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the shadows around it began to pull away from the edges, revealing a place she couldn't quite understand. A twisted, half-formed version of her cabin, but more wrong. The walls were cracked, the floor was buckled, and the air was thick with an unsettling static. The space seemed to bend and ripple, as though it wasn't quite sure if it wanted to exist at all. "I am real," the figure replied, its voice now dripping with malice. "You've known me all your life. I've been here, Amelia. Right under your skin." She took a step back, her pulse quickening. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening. You're just a nightmare." The figure's lips curled into a smile, a sickening, unnatural grin that sent a shiver of terror down her spine. "You always did think of me as a nightmare, didn't you? But I'm much more than that. I'm everything you've buried. All the things you didn't want to face. And now, Amelia, now you have nowhere to run." The floor beneath her feet groaned as though it were alive. Amelia stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls around her began to close in, and she realized with a horrifying clarity that this wasn't just some twisted illusion. This was real. The void was real. The figure was real. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking with desperation. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its expression mockingly patient. "I want you to remember, Amelia. I want you to remember everything." The ground shifted beneath her, and with a jolt, the cabin from her childhood materialized before her eyes. But it wasn't the home she had known. It was dark, abandoned, the windows shattered and the door hanging crookedly on its hinges. The trees outside were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. Amelia gasped, a memory coming to her in fragments. Her parents, her mother's cold eyes, the darkness of the forest surrounding them. She remembered the fear she had felt when she was just a child. The voices, the shadows that had followed her. But the details were blurred, like they were locked behind a door she couldn't open. "Remember," the figure whispered again, its voice like ice sliding down her spine. The air grew thick and the temperature dropped so low that she could see her breath. The walls of the cabin started to decay, the wood splintering and rotting as though the house itself had aged centuries in mere moments. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized, this wasn't just the house from her past. This was the place where it all began. The memories rushed back in a tidal wave of horror. She was a child again, standing in front of the well, her parents arguing in the background. Her mother's eyes, cold and distant. Her father's voice raised in anger. She remembered the fight, the shoving, and then the silence. "No?" Amelia whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. But the figure, it knew. It always had. "You didn't mean to," it repeated mockingly, "but you did." It took another step forward, and this time Amelia couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, unable to escape the truth that was crashing over her like a wave. I didn't want to. I was just a child." Her voice broke as the figure reached out, its hands like tendrils of darkness wrapping around her. "No," she screamed, trying to pull away, but it was no use. "You killed them," the figure hissed, its voice a cacophony of voices now, all the people she had ever hurt or betrayed. "You buried them. You buried it all." Suddenly, the walls cracked open and a flood of memories came rushing at her. The accident, the lies, the guilt, the suffocating, all-encompassing guilt that had followed her for years. Her father's face, distorted in the water, his eyes staring up at her, accusing her. Her mother's disappointed gaze as she turned away from her. "You think you've escaped," the figure sneered, "but you never will. You can't run from yourself, Amelia." With one final, crushing pull, the figure dragged her into the darkness, her screams lost in the void. And then all was silent. But in the stillness, Amelia could hear something whispering. The last thing she heard was her own voice. "It was my fault. I killed them." As the screen fades to black, a single question lingers in the air. Will Amelia ever escape the guilt that haunts her? Or is she doomed to repeat her past forever? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that bell icon to be the first to know when the next terrifying chapter drops. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, not through your windows but through the deepest corners of your mind? Meet Mia, a genius hacker who thought she had control over every system she touched. But when an anonymous client hires her to crack a file called the Whisper Vault, she uncovers a chilling web of psychological games that begin to rewrite her reality. Strange messages appear on her screen, voices whisper her secrets in the dark, and the line between her mind and the digital world starts to blur. Who is behind this? A mastermind? A ghost? Or is it all in her head? As Mia dives deeper, she realizes the final challenge isn't just cracking the code, it's surviving the twisted truths hidden within herself. Are you ready to step into her mind? But beware, what you'll find there might just follow you back into your own. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the computer fan and the faint clicking of keys under Mia's nimble fingers. Her apartment, dimly lit by the glow of multiple monitors, felt like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. Mia thrived in isolation. Out here, in the silence of cyberspace, she was untouchable. Shadow Cipher, the name that made the dark web shudder, was a ghost, a myth, and she liked it that way. Until tonight. Her inbox pinged, a message from an unknown source. That wasn't unusual. People often sought her help for impossible jobs. But this one was different. The subject line read, "Solve this and you'll know the truth about yourself." She hesitated. It wasn't every day that someone poked at her carefully guarded walls. With a faint smirk, she opened the message. The text was bare bones, no pleasantries, no context, just an attachment labeled the Whisper Vault. The file was encrypted in layers she'd never seen before, a puzzle more intricate than anything she'd tackled. Mia's curiosity flickered. She couldn't resist the challenge. But the deeper she went, the stranger things became. The first sign was subtle. Her monitors flickered, not from a system glitch but as if someone was controlling them. Then her headphones, silent for hours, buzzed faintly, almost imperceptibly. It sounded like a whisper. "Hello, Mia?" She froze. The voice wasn't a recording. It knew her name. Mia ripped off the headphones, her heart pounding. She scanned her system for breaches. No logs of intrusions, no malware detected. Nothing. But the whispers continued, not in her headphones anymore but in the room itself. Curious, aren't you? Her head snapped toward the corner of her apartment, where shadows pooled unnaturally. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to continue or shut everything down. The screen glitched again and a new message appeared. Welcome to the game. You've already started. There's no way back now. The text blinked off and her entire system crashed. Darkness engulfed the room. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint sound of breathing, except it wasn't hers. Mia's pulse thudded in her ears as she reached for the small flashlight she kept in her desk drawer. The apartment was unnervingly still. The silence pressed against her like a suffocating weight, broken only by the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her. She shone the flashlight toward the corner of the room, the one where the shadows had gathered. Nothing. Just an empty chair and the faint outline of her coat hanging on the wall hook. She exhaled, but her hands still trembled. When her system finally rebooted, the screen glowed a pale blue as if it had been waiting for her. A single file had replaced her desktop icons. Its name was unassuming but chilling in its simplicity. Listen. She hesitated, then clicked. A low hum filled the room, crawling into her ears like an unwelcome intruder. It was more than sound. It felt alive, vibrating in her chest, almost like it was syncing with her heartbeat. Then came the whispers, fragmented and indistinct at first, like a dozen voices speaking over one another. Mia. The voice was clearer this time, a low, gravelly tone that made her blood run cold. You shouldn't have opened it. Her monitors flashed, and an image blinked onto the screen, a grainy black and white live feed of her apartment. The angle was high, from the corner of the ceiling, capturing her sitting at her desk. What the hell? She whispered, her voice trembling. She scanned the room frantically, searching for the source of the camera. Nothing stood out. No blinking lights, no devices she didn't recognize. But there it was, staring back at her from the monitor, herself frozen in fear. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony. She slammed her palms against her ears, trying to block them out, but they burrowed deeper into her mind. Words began to stand out, pulling themselves from the noise. Run. Don't look. It's watching you. Then the screen changed again. The live feed zoomed in on her face, pixelating briefly before sharpening. Her reflection didn't move in sync with her. It stared directly at her, eyes unblinking, lips curling into a smile. Who are you? She demanded, her voice barely a whisper. Her reflection tilted its head, mimicking the motion she hadn't made. Its smile widened unnaturally, stretching beyond what should have been possible. And then it spoke, though her own lips didn't move. I am the answer you're afraid to find. The lights in her apartment flickered violently, and the whispers reached a deafening roar. The screen went black, leaving her staring at her own distorted reflection in the darkened glass. The silence returned, but it was different this time, heavier, more oppressive. She felt the weight of something standing behind her. Her body froze, every nerve screaming for her to turn around, but fear held her in place. Mia. The voice came again, directly behind her this time, soft and slow, dragging out her name like a threat. She couldn't stop herself. Her head turned, inch by inch, until she saw it. A figure cloaked in shadows, its form shifting as if it were made of smoke. Eyes like glowing embers burned into hers, and a crooked smile split its face. It leaned closer, and its breath was ice against her skin. You open the door. Now you'll never close it. Mia bolted from her chair, tripping over the tangle of wires at her feet. She scrambled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadowy figure didn't chase her. It didn't have to. It stood still, watching, its presence filling every corner of the room. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with every second. They weren't just in the room anymore, they were inside her, clawing at her thoughts, pulling at her memories. She clutched her head, screaming against the invasion, but the voices only laughed. Welcome to the vault, Mia, they said in unison. It's where you've always belonged. And then everything went dark. Mia woke to a suffocating silence. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. Her back rested against a cold, metallic surface, and the air smelled sterile like a hospital. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred as she blinked against the faint, fluorescent light that buzzed somewhere above her. She pushed herself up, her hands brushing against the smooth metal beneath her. It felt like a table, a surgical table. Her heart pounded as she looked around. The room was stark white, its walls featureless except for a single monitor mounted on the far side. The monitor flickered to life, its glow drawing her attention like a moth to a flame. Words began to scroll across the screen, slow and deliberate. "You are not alone." Her breath hitched. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the emptiness. The screen responded instantly, "You shouldn't have run, Mia." The room plunged into darkness again. Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled to find her footing. A soft hum filled the air, distant at first but steadily growing louder. It wasn't mechanical, it sounded like whispers, layered and rhythmic as if they were circling her. She spun around, her eyes straining to adjust to the dark. Shapes began to form in the shadows, distorted figures that moved unnaturally, flickering like static on an old television. "Stop it!" she screamed, pressing her back against the wall. The whispers grew louder, their words incoherent but urgent, like they were trying to tell her something. The figures edged closer, their forms barely visible but undeniably wrong. Limbs too long, heads tilted at impossible angles. The monitor flickered back on, bathing the room in a pale light. The figures vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, but the whispers lingered, quieter now, almost mournful. Mia's eyes darted to the screen, which now displayed a new message. "Do you remember the fire, Mia?" Her stomach turned. The fire. She didn't want to think about it, she hadn't thought about it in years. Images flashed in her mind, the heat, the smoke, the sound of breaking glass. A child's scream, her scream, echoing through the chaos. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The monitor responded, "You opened the vault. Everything is real now." The hum returned, this time accompanied by a faint tapping sound, like footsteps on metal. Mia's heart raced as she scanned the room, but there was no one there. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the floor, it was coming from above. Her eyes shot to the ceiling where she saw something move in the shadows. A figure, crawling like a spider, its joints bending in unnatural directions. No, no. The thing dropped from the ceiling with a sickening thud. It landed on all fours but quickly rose, its height towering over her. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned like dying embers. Mia scrambled backward, her hand brushing against something cold and metallic. A scalpel. Without thinking, she grabbed it, holding it out in front of her like a lifeline. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate as if mocking her. Then it spoke, its voice a chorus of overlapping whispers. "You think you can cut yourself free? You've already been chosen." Her grip tightened on the scalpel, but her hands were trembling. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its form glitching like it was both there and not there. The whispers grew louder again, and the room began to warp. The walls stretched and shifted, the light twisting into unnatural shapes. Mia felt like she was falling, even though her feet were firmly planted. The scalpel slipped from her grasp as the room spiraled into chaos. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head as the voices flooded her mind. "Let me go," she cried. But the figure's voice cut through the noise, clear and commanding. "You can't run from what's inside you, Mia. The vault is you." The room snapped back into focus. The figure was gone. The whispers were silent. Mia was alone, sitting on the cold metal floor. The monitor flickered again, displaying a single line of text. "The game has only just begun." Mia sat on the cold floor, her breath shallow and uneven. The monitor's glow was the only source of light, casting eerie shadows across the white walls. The words on the screen, "The game has only just begun," seemed to pulse, almost alive. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to block out the voice that still echoed in her mind. "The vault is you." What did it mean? Her heart pounded as she stood, her knees trembling beneath her. She had to find a way out. She moved toward the walls, running her hands along the smooth surface. There was no door, no seam, nothing to suggest an exit. The sterile air felt thicker now, pressing down on her like an invisible force. Then the hum returned. It started as a faint vibration, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, reverberating through the room. She spun around, searching for its source. The monitor flickered again, and the screen split into multiple windows. Each one displayed fragments of memories, her memories. There was the fire, the raging flames licking at the walls of her childhood home. There was her father, yelling for her to run. There was her younger self, curled up in a closet, her hands clamped over her ears. "Stop," she whispered, backing away from the screen. But the images didn't stop. They shifted to moments she had buried deep, ones she had sworn never to revisit. The time she hacked into the hospital system to erase a debt that could have cost her mother her life. The time she exposed a corporation's darkest secrets, forcing them into bankruptcy. The time she betrayed a friend for a job that promised anonymity and power. The whispers began again, faint but insistent. "You've always been in the vault, Mia? You built it yourself?" She shook her head, her back pressing against the wall. "This isn't real. It's not real." The monitor zoomed in on a single image. A younger Mia, staring at a computer screen in a dimly lit room. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. On the screen before her was the file name, the Whisper Vault. Her stomach turned. How could that be? She had never seen this file before tonight. The monitor spoke this time, its voice distorted and hollow. "Do you remember the deal?" "What deal?" she snapped, her voice trembling. The screen shifted, displaying a message she had long forgotten. She read the words aloud, her voice cracking. "We give you the power to uncover any truth. In return, you open the door when called. Signed, The Vault." Her vision blurred as the memories came flooding back. She had been desperate back then, a young hacker looking for answers, for control in a world that had taken everything from her. She had stumbled across a hidden forum, its messages cryptic and enticing. The Vault had promised her unlimited access to knowledge, a chance to rewrite her destiny. But she had never read the fine print. "No," she whispered, sinking to the floor. I didn't know." "You did," the voice replied, louder now, surrounding her. "You've always known." The hum transformed into a low growl, and the shadows in the room began to shift again. This time they didn't just flicker, they took shape, forming figures that loomed over her. Their faces were blurred, but their eyes burned with accusation. "You stole from us. You exposed us. You destroyed us." Their voices overlapped, growing louder with each accusation. Mia clamped her hands over her ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside her head, ripping through her thoughts like claws. The monitor flashed again, displaying a single question. "Will you face the truth or will you run again?" Mia's breath hitched. She didn't understand what it wanted from her. "What truth?" "I've done everything to survive." The figures stepped closer, their forms glitching as if the very air around them was unstable. One of them knelt, its face inches from hers. Its voice was calm, almost gentle. "You survived by becoming one of us, Mia. You are the Vault." Her heart sank as the realization hit her. The Vault wasn't just a file, it wasn't just a game. It was a construct of her own making, built from every lie, every betrayal, every piece of herself she had sacrificed to gain control. "No," her voice was barely a whisper. The figures began to dissolve, merging into the walls, the floor, the very air around her. The room warped again, bending and stretching as if it were alive. The monitor's glow dimmed, and a final message appeared. "The door is open, Mia. Will you step through?" The walls split, revealing a dark corridor lined with faint, flickering lights. The hum grew louder, beckoning her forward. Mia stared into the void, her mind racing. If she stepped through, there was no guarantee she would return. But staying here meant facing the weight of everything she had done, everything she had become. She took a shaky step forward. The corridor seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting as if watching her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she crossed the threshold. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the whisper of her own voice. "Welcome home." Mia stepped into the corridor, her breath shallow and her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The air was cold and heavy, carrying a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. The faint lights along the walls flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its walls narrowing as if to suffocate her. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound distorted and trailing behind her like ghostly whispers. Mia gripped her arms tightly, her skin crawling as she felt something, a presence, watching her. She stopped. The silence was deafening, but then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, distant yet unmistakable. She spun around, her eyes darting to the darkness behind her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the walls. The corridor seemed to pulse, its lights dimming further until she was left standing in near total darkness. Her breathing quickened as she fumbled forward, her hands brushing against the cold, uneven walls. The floor beneath her felt strange now, wet and sticky. She glanced down and froze. The floor was coated in a dark, viscous liquid that glistened faintly under the flickering lights. What? Her stomach churned as she stumbled backward, but her foot caught on something solid. She turned to see what it was, and her heart dropped. A hand, pale and lifeless, jutted out from the shadows, its fingers curled as if in desperation. The body it belonged to was barely visible, but the face was unmistakable. It was hers. Mia gasped, staggering away from the sight. "No, no, this isn't real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the corridor didn't let her go. The light surged back to life, flooding the space with an intense, blinding glow. Shadows writhed along the walls, twisting and merging into grotesque forms. They had no eyes, but she could feel them staring, their gazes piercing through her. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was a grotesque parody of her own, the features warped and stretched. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it spoke in a distorted version of her voice. "You can't run from yourself, Mia," she screamed, bolting down the corridor, her feet splashing through the blood. The whispers grew louder, turning into shrieks that clawed at her mind. The walls seemed to close in, the corridor twisting and bending like a living thing. Ahead, she saw a door, a massive rusted metal door with a faint glow seeping through the cracks. Desperation drove her forward, her legs burning as she pushed herself to reach it. The growl returned, louder and more menacing, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. She didn't dare look back. She reached the door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Come on," she cried, throwing her weight against it. Behind her, the growling grew deafening. She turned her head just enough to see them. The figures, their forms shifting and multiplying, their mouths gaping as they lunged toward her. In a final act of desperation, she slammed her fists against the door. It groaned, the metal giving way just as the shadows reached her. She fell through, tumbling into the room beyond. The door slammed shut behind her, silencing the chaos. She lay on the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling. When she looked up, she found herself in a circular room, its walls covered in mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her from every angle, each version slightly different. Some were younger, others older, but all of them wore the same haunted expression. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it sat a small, black box. The box pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Mia approached it cautiously, her reflection watching her every move. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became, emanating not from the room but from within her own mind. When she reached the pedestal, she saw the words etched into the surface. "To close the vault, you must unlock yourself." Her hands trembled as she touched the box. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the moment her fingers made contact, the whispers stopped. But the silence didn't last. The mirrors shattered simultaneously, shards flying outward and dissolving before they hit the ground. The room plunged into darkness, and Mia felt the box grow heavier in her hands. Suddenly, the voice returned, deep and resonant, filling the space around her. "You've come this far, Mia. Are you ready to face the truth?" The box opened on its own, revealing a glowing orb that floated just above its surface. The light was warm, almost comforting, but as Mia stared into it, her vision blurred. Images flooded her mind, her past, her mistakes, her darkest secrets. But there was more. She saw people she didn't recognize, places she had never been, and a world that felt foreign yet familiar. The orb pulsed, and the voice spoke again. "Everything begins and ends with you." Mia's scream echoed into the void as the orb's light consumed her, pulling her into its depths. The room disappeared, leaving only silence. And then, faintly, the whispers began again. Mia's scream dissolved into a deafening silence, replaced by an overwhelming darkness. She couldn't feel the floor beneath her feet or the walls around her. It was as though she had been swallowed by an infinite void, suspended in nothingness. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, relentless and piercing. They overlapped, a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some laughing, others wailing in despair. "You've always been here, Mia. There's no escape. Do you think you deserve freedom?" Mia clutched her head, her nails digging into her scalp. "Stop. Please stop," she begged, her voice trembling. A faint light flickered in the distance, pale and cold, like the glow of a dying star. Desperate for any sense of direction, Mia stumbled toward it. Each step felt heavier, as though unseen hands were pulling her back, dragging her into the abyss. As she drew closer, the light revealed a figure, a woman standing perfectly still, her back turned to Mia. Her long, dark hair cascaded over a tattered white dress, and her feet hovered just above the ground. Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But something about the figure was familiar, compelling her forward despite the icy dread spreading through her veins. "Hello?" Mia called out, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. Mia reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the woman's shoulder. The moment they made contact, the figure spun around with inhuman speed, revealing a face that wasn't human. The eyes were hollow voids, weeping black ichor that dripped down her cheeks. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. A guttural scream erupted from her throat, the sound so loud and raw it felt as though it could shatter reality itself. Mia stumbled backward, falling onto the invisible ground. The figure lunged at her, its clawed hands reaching out, but just before it touched her, it dissolved into a cloud of ash. The light flickered and died, plunging Mia back into darkness. She lay there, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the reprieve was short-lived. A new sound emerged, soft at first like the tapping of fingernails on glass. It grew louder, more frantic, until it was all around her. Mia turned, her heart pounding as she realized the sound was coming from below. She looked down and gasped. The darkness beneath her was no longer empty. It was a translucent surface, and beneath it, dozens of faces stared up at her. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths moving soundlessly as they pounded on the barrier, desperate to escape. One face pressed closer and Mia's stomach dropped. It was her own. "What is this?" she whispered, scrambling to her feet. The surface cracked, fine lines spreading outward like spiderwebs. The faces below grew more frantic, their movements violent and erratic. And then the surface shattered. Mia fell, plunging into the void. The coldness enveloped her, and the whispers morphed into screams. She tried to scream herself, but no sound came. She was drowning, suffocating, her lungs burning as the darkness consumed her. Just as she thought she would succumb, she landed hard on a rough, uneven surface. The impact knocked the air from her lungs and she lay there, gasping, her body aching. She opened her eyes and found herself in a new place, a vast, decaying library. The shelves stretched endlessly into the darkness, filled with books that seemed to hum with malevolent energy. A single desk sat in the center, illuminated by a flickering candle. On the desk lay an open book, its pages blank except for a single sentence written in crimson ink. "Write your confession." Mia approached the desk, her legs shaky. She picked up the pen beside the book, its tip already stained red. What do you want from me?" she whispered. The room answered with a low growl, the sound vibrating through the air. Mia looked down at the book, her hand trembling. Memories flooded her mind, every lie she had told, every secret she had buried, every action she had justified to herself. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. Her hand moved on its own, the pen scratching against the paper. She wrote in a frenzy, the words spilling out before she could stop them. With each confession, the shadows around her grew darker, closing in. When she finished, the book snapped shut and the candle extinguished. A deep voice spoke from the darkness, calm yet terrifying. "You've opened the vault, Mia. Now you must live with what's inside." The ground beneath her began to shake, the shelves toppling over one by one. From the darkness came the figures again, their twisted forms crawling toward her. This time there was no running. The last thing Mia saw was her own reflection in their hollow eyes before they consumed her, dragging her into the vault's depths. The whispers faded and the room fell silent once more. The book remained on the desk, its cover now marked with a single name: Mia Winters. The vault had claimed another. Mia's consciousness flickered, caught between the swirling void and fragments of reality. She was somewhere and nowhere, her body weightless, her mind tethered to an overwhelming sense of dread. When she opened her eyes, she found herself sitting in a chair in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were plain and featureless, except for a single mirror on the far side. A cold metal table stood before her, empty except for the black box she thought she had escaped. Her heart sank. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening." The box pulsed faintly, the same rhythmic glow that mimicked a heartbeat. The room was deathly silent except for that sound, thump, 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 growing louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and the mirror on the wall rippled like water. A figure stepped through it, impossibly tall, cloaked in shadows. Its presence was oppressive, filling the room with an unbearable weight. Mia tried to stand, but her body wouldn't move. It was as though the chair was part of her, holding her in place. The figure spoke, its voice resonating deep within her mind. "You unlocked the vault, Mia. Did you think there wouldn't be a price?" "I didn't mean to," Mia cried. "I was trying to stop it. I didn't know." The figure leaned closer, its face obscured, but its eyes, two burning pinpricks of light, pierced through her soul. You knew, it said, its tone devoid of sympathy. You sought the truth, and now you must face it. The box on the table opened slowly, its lid creaking. From within, a dark mist poured out, coiling through the air like living tendrils. They moved toward Mia, brushing against her skin, leaving trails of ice in their wake. Images flashed before her eyes, scenes from her life, distorted and twisted. She saw herself as a child, alone in a dark room, the door locked from the outside. She saw herself in front of a computer, her fingers trembling as she typed the codes that had brought her to this moment. And she saw the faces of the people she had betrayed, their expressions etched with pain and fear. The mist whispered to her, voices overlapping in an endless chorus. You took from us. You left us to suffer. You cannot undo what's been done. Tears streamed down Mia's face as she struggled against the invisible force holding her. I didn't want this. Please let me go. The figure loomed over her, the shadows around it writhing like snakes. Let you go, it repeated mockingly. The vault isn't a prison, Mia. It's a mirror. Everything you see, everything you fear, is you. The mist surged forward, wrapping around Mia's wrists and neck. It lifted her from the chair, suspending her in midair. She gasped, her vision blurring as the darkness closed in. Just as she thought she would fade away, the mist recoiled, and she fell to the ground with a jarring thud. The room dissolved, and she was back in her apartment, sitting in front of her computer. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The soft hum of the CPU, the faint glow of the screen, it was as though none of it had happened. But then she noticed the file on her desktop, one that hadn't been there before. It was labeled vault.mp4. Her hands shook as she clicked on it. The video began to play and her heart stopped. It was her. Sitting at the desk, staring into the camera with hollow eyes. The Mia on the screen leaned forward, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Did you think it was over? Before Mia could react, her computer screen flickered, and the video file disappeared. In its place was a single line of text. The vault is always watching. The lights in her apartment flickered, and a soft tapping sound came from behind her. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The black box sat on the floor, its lid slightly ajar. A whisper echoed through the room, chilling and familiar. You're next. The screen faded to black. What if the people you thought you knew best weren't who they seemed? What if a town you trusted for years turned out to hold dark secrets no one could ever imagine? Henry, Watson, and the others thought they knew their small town inside out. But what happened when they uncovered the terrifying truth buried beneath its quiet streets? The kind of truth that had been waiting for years to claw its way to the surface. Are they ready for what they'll find? Or will they become the next to disappear? Henry stood on the edge of the dilapidated bridge, staring down into the black, swirling waters below. His breath came out in visible puffs, dissipating into the cold, moonlit night. The town of Woodford looked calm from here, too calm. It had always been a quiet place, tucked away in the heart of nowhere. A town where everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. For years, Henry had come here to visit his best friend, Watson, who'd grown up in the small town. They had spent summers playing in the woods, swimming in the creek, and getting into trouble together. But something had changed. The town no longer felt like home. The people were different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a tension that sat in your chest like a weight, slowly crushing the life out of you. It had been a year since Henry's last visit, but nothing about the town seemed to have changed. The same sleepy streets, the same old houses, and the same cold silence. But that silence felt louder now, more oppressive, as though the town was waiting, watching. As Henry shifted on the bridge, he felt the strange sensation that he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his stomach twisted with an unshakable feeling of unease. He glanced around, but the streetlights seemed far off in the distance, their faint glow barely cutting through the thick night. The town was empty. At least it seemed empty. Then he heard it. A faint whisper. It was soft, too soft to be real, but it scraped at his senses like nails on a chalkboard. He turned quickly, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing there. Only the wind, whistling eerily through the trees. Henry took a step back, trying to shake the chill that had spread through him. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as he began to walk off the bridge, the sensation grew stronger, like something was following him. His footsteps echoed on the damp wood, and he could feel the eyes on him. The town seemed to lean in, its quiet streets pressing against him. There was no one around. So why did it feel like something was waiting for him? Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. Henry? The voice was low and urgent, sending a jolt of panic through his spine. He spun around, his heart thudding in his chest. There, standing in the shadow of an old oak tree, was Lucas. Henry hadn't seen him in years. He looked different, thinner, paler. His eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. He looked as though he had seen something that had broken him. "You shouldn't be here," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "None of us should be." Henry frowned, his mind racing. "What are you talking about? What's going on? You're scaring me, Lucas." Lucas's eyes darted around the dark street, checking to see if anyone was watching. His face twisted with fear as if he was trying to decide whether or not to speak. "There's something wrong with this place. There's something wrong with the people here," Lucas whispered, stepping closer. "I didn't want to believe it at first, but I've seen it, Henry. It's real. It's happening again." "Seen what?" Henry's voice faltered. "What are you talking about? What's happening?" Lucas looked away, shaking his head. "The disappearances. They've been happening for years. People just vanish. It doesn't make sense, but it happens. And no one talks about it. No one says a word." Henry's blood ran cold. He had heard rumors about disappearances in Woodford, strange, unsolved cases of people vanishing without a trace. But it was always written off as just the kind of thing that happened in small towns. People leave. People disappear. People get tired of life and leave behind their old lives for something new. But that didn't explain the feeling in his gut. The feeling that the people who had vanished had never really left. "And now I think I know why," Lucas continued, his voice trembling. "It's not just the town that's hiding something. The people here, they're not who they seem. I've been digging, trying to find out what happened to those who disappeared, but every lead I've followed just gets me deeper into this twisted web. I can't get out, Henry. And neither can you." Henry took a step back, his heart racing. "You're not making any sense, Lucas. What are you saying? Are you saying the people here are involved in these disappearances?" Lucas nodded grimly. "Yes, and it's worse than you can imagine. You don't just disappear from this town. When they take you, they make sure you're never coming back. No one talks about it, but I've seen the signs. The things they do." Henry's mind was reeling. What kind of things? What had Lucas seen? His friend had always been the rational one, the one who dismissed anything even remotely supernatural. For him to be this afraid, this broken, could only mean one thing. Whatever was going on in Woodford, it was more than just a few missing people. "What are they doing to people?" Henry asked, his voice low and trembling. Lucas hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his eyes wild with fear. "I don't know. But it's not just about taking them. It's about what happens afterward. The way they change. I don't know if they're taking people for some kind of ritual, or if they're trying to control them somehow, but I know one thing. No one is safe here anymore." Before Henry could respond, Lucas grabbed his arm, his grip tight and desperate. "You have to leave, Henry," he urged, his voice desperate. "You have to leave before they get you too. Before it's too late." Henry's mind raced. He had to understand. What was happening here? Why were people disappearing? Why was Lucas so afraid? But just as he opened his mouth to speak, a chilling gust of wind blew through the street, snuffing out the dim lights from the lampposts. For a brief moment, the world around him was pitch black, the only sound the eerie rustling of the trees. When the wind died down and the lights flickered back to life, Lucas was gone. Henry's pulse spiked, panic rising in his chest. He spun around, searching the empty street, but there was no sign of his friend. The entire town felt different now, like it was closing in around him. Suddenly, a sharp, blood-curdling scream echoed in the distance. It was distant but unmistakable. Someone was in trouble. Someone was in danger. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't just stand there. He had to find out what was happening, what had happened to Lucas, and to all the others. He turned on his heel and sprinted down the street, the feeling of being watched creeping up behind him with every step. The town was alive with dark secrets, and tonight they were ready to reveal them. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, his legs moving faster than they had in years. The empty streets of Woodford seemed to stretch on endlessly as he ran, the world around him dark and oppressive. The scream had echoed through the town, but now it was silent. Too silent. The houses on either side of the road were still, their dark windows like lifeless eyes staring back at him. The air felt thick, heavy with something he couldn't place, something unnatural. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his head. What had happened to Lucas? What had he meant when he talked about the disappearances? And why had the town suddenly turned into this nightmare? His footfalls echoed louder in the quiet night, the sound bouncing off the walls of the buildings around him. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. But no matter how fast he ran, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. He could feel eyes on him, hidden in the darkness, waiting for the right moment. Then, just as he was about to turn the corner, he heard something. A soft shuffle, barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. He froze, his body tense, and strained his ears. It came again, slower this time, deliberate. Someone or something was moving nearby. He glanced to his left, toward the alley between two old houses. The shadows were thick, but he could make out the faintest outline of a figure, tall, slender, and hunched as though it were bending in a way that wasn't quite natural. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just waiting. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Was it human? Or something else? He wanted to run, to get away, but his legs felt frozen, as though the weight of the town itself was pressing down on him, holding him in place. A voice suddenly broke the silence, low and distant. "You shouldn't have come back, Henry." He whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. No one was behind him. The street was empty. But the voice had been clear. It had come from the alley, from the shadows. A chill ran down his spine. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of Woodford. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a force he couldn't explain. With trembling hands, Henry reached for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He dialed Watson's number, no answer. He tried again. Nothing. Frustration and fear twisted inside him. This wasn't just some strange coincidence anymore. It was something much worse. Something that had been waiting for him, lurking beneath the surface of the town he thought he knew. Then he heard it again. The shuffle. Closer this time. Much closer. Henry turned his head toward the alley again, and the figure was there, standing in the shadows. It wasn't just standing, it was watching him, its head tilting unnaturally to one side as if studying him like a specimen. His blood ran cold as the figure slowly stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was dressed in tattered clothes, and as it emerged from the shadows, Henry could see its face, or what was left of it. The figure's face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, blackened eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. Its skin hung loose, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, and its mouth was open in a silent scream, as though it had been trapped in an eternal moment of agony. But there was no sound, no breath, just the hollow emptiness of its stare. Henry staggered backward, his legs shaking, his heart racing. This wasn't a person. It wasn't even close. The figure took another step forward, and then, with a sudden, swift movement, it lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing Henry's arm with a grip so cold it burned. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the figure's fingers dug into his skin like claws, holding him in place. "Leave, leave now," the figure rasped in a voice so broken and hollow it sent chills through his entire body. What are you?" Henry stammered, his voice cracking in fear. The figure's lips twitched as if trying to form words, but the only sound that escaped was a garbled, inhuman growl. It shook its head slowly, and Henry felt the weight of its cold stare pierce deep into him. And then, with a sudden motion, the figure released its grip. Henry stumbled backward, his legs giving way as he collapsed to the ground. He scrambled to get up, but the figure didn't move toward him. He just stood there watching. "Not yet," it whispered. "Not yet." Henry didn't wait to hear more. He pushed himself to his feet and bolted down the street, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He had to find Lucas. He had to find some answers. But as he ran, the sensation of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger, more oppressive. The whole town felt like it was closing in on him, like it was alive, breathing, waiting for him to make a mistake. He could hear whispers now all around him. Soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to echo from the walls, from the very ground beneath his feet. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on just getting away, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Henry turned the corner, his eyes scanning for any sign of safety. The street was dark, but ahead he saw the faint glow of a lamppost. He ran toward it, desperate to escape whatever was lurking in the shadows. But as he reached the lamppost, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. It was Lucas. But it wasn't Lucas like Henry remembered. He was standing under the light, his eyes wide and unblinking, his face pale and twisted in an unnatural way. His mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, too wide to be human, and his skin had a sickly sheen, like it was melting off his bones. "Lucas?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at him with those empty black eyes. The smile never wavered. Henry felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't his friend. Not anymore. And then Lucas, or whatever it was, took a step forward. And another. And another. Henry's body screamed for him to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead. He could only watch in horror as the figure advanced toward him, its smile growing wider with each step. The shadows around them seemed to deepen, the world becoming more and more distorted, like reality itself was warping. And just as Lucas, if that's what it was almost within arm's reach, Henry saw something in the figure's hands. A long, jagged knife. Its blade gleamed in the lamplight, sharp and deadly. "Run," the figure whispered. But it wasn't Lucas's voice. It was deeper. And colder. Henry turned and sprinted, his mind clouded with fear. But even as he ran, he could hear the sound of footsteps behind him. And the whispers. They were closing in. And no matter how fast he ran, he knew one thing for sure. There was no escaping Woodford's dark secret. Henry didn't look back. His legs moved on their own, driven by pure instinct, each step faster than the last. The sound of his breath echoed in his ears as he sprinted down the darkened streets of Woodford, the flickering streetlights above casting erratic, dancing shadows on the cracked pavement. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest it almost drowned out everything else, but there was one sound that he couldn't escape. The footsteps. They were still behind him. He didn't dare glance over his shoulder. If he did, he knew the figure would be right there, that twisted smile stretching impossibly wide, its black eyes staring straight through him. But even without looking, he could feel it. The oppressive, suffocating presence. It was as though the entire town was alive, watching, waiting. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just voices anymore. They were screams, distant at first, like they were coming from somewhere far away, but growing closer, more desperate. Some of the voices were familiar. He thought he heard Lucas's voice, pleading, calling his name, but the words didn't make sense. They were garbled, like someone was choking on them, suffocating on their own breath. "Henry! Henry!" came a voice from his left, so close he could feel the air shift around him. He jerked his head toward the sound, his pulse quickening. The street was empty. No one. Just the endless stretch of houses, the broken windows staring at him like empty eyes. But the voice, he knew that voice. It was Lucas, but different. Distorted, like something was trying to imitate it. "Henry?" The voice was a whisper, but it held a weight to it. A command, almost. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself harder, running faster, but the whispers followed. They were in the wind, in the air, in the ground beneath his feet. The whole town seemed to be breathing with him, pressing in from all sides. He could feel its pulse, its heartbeat, beating in rhythm with his own. And then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard something else. A door opening. The sound of it was soft at first, barely audible over the rush of his blood in his ears, but it was there. It was a door creaking open, somewhere behind him. He turned his head just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure standing in the doorway of one of the old houses. The figure was shadowed, its outline barely visible in the darkness, but there was something about it that made his stomach drop. It was watching him. The door closed quietly as though it was never there at all. Henry's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening. What was that? Who had opened it? And then a sound that made his blood run cold. A scream. A woman's scream. It was muffled, like it was coming from inside a house, but the terror in it was unmistakable. The voice was raw, desperate, as if someone was being torn apart inside. Without thinking, Henry ran toward the source of the scream. He didn't know why. He should have kept running. He should have gotten as far away from this cursed town as possible. But something inside him, a force he couldn't explain, compelled him to move toward it. He rounded a corner and found himself standing in front of an old, decrepit house. It was one of the largest on the street, its windows boarded up, its front door hanging crooked on its hinges. The porch sagged under the weight of time, and the paint was chipped and peeling, exposing the rotting wood beneath. The scream came again, louder this time, more frantic. It was coming from inside. Without thinking, Henry grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. It creaked loudly in protest, but it gave way easily, revealing the dark interior of the house. Inside it was cold. Not just chilly, but bone-chilling. The air felt thick, suffocating. The smell of decay hit him immediately, damp wood, mold, and something more foul, like something had been left to rot for years. "Hello?" Henry called, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound confident. "Is anyone here?" Silence. The only sound was the slow creaking of the house settling, the soft scrape of wood on wood. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained and torn in places. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. Then he heard it, a soft sound like a breath, a whisper barely audible but there. It came from the end of the hall just beyond the turn. Henry's body stiffened. He couldn't bring himself to move to go any further, but his feet betrayed him. They moved on their own, stepping softly, almost silently, toward the source of the sound. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step, the shadows growing darker, thicker, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear in the air. The house felt wrong. It was as though it had been waiting for him, as though it had known he would come. He reached the end of the hallway and the room before him was open. The door was ajar, but something inside, something beyond the door, seemed to pulse, to throb with an unnatural energy. "Help me," came the voice again, this time clearer, almost desperate. It sounded like a woman, pleading, crying for help. Henry's heart raced as he pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, save for the faintest sliver of moonlight coming through a cracked window. The shadows in the room seemed to sway and twist, like they were alive, moving with a mind of their own. And then he saw her. A woman kneeling on the floor, her hands pressed against the wall. She was shaking, trembling, her hair a wild mess, her clothes torn and stained. Her face was pale, but it was her eyes that froze him in place. Her eyes were black, completely black. She turned her head slowly, her movements jerky, unnatural. And as she looked at him, Henry felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force, pressing against his chest, choking the air from his lungs. Leave now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like it was being dragged out of her against her will. Henry couldn't move. His body refused to respond. All he could do was stand there, staring into her dark, endless eyes. And then the room seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched out, crawling along the walls, reaching for him. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before. His breath came in ragged gasps, his skin prickling with a sense of impending doom. The woman's mouth opened wider, stretching impossibly far. Her teeth were jagged, sharp like broken glass. And as she smiled, a smile that was all teeth, Henry felt his blood turn to ice. "Henry," she rasped, her voice distorted, no longer human. "You shouldn't have come back." The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. And the last thing Henry heard was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. And then nothing. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to spin around him, and for a moment, he wondered if he had somehow fallen into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The door that had slammed shut behind him now felt like a trap, one he could never open again. The oppressive weight of the air pressed down on his chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. He turned back to face the woman on the floor. Her form was still there, contorted in that unnatural position. Her smile now stretched even wider, as though mocking him. Her eyes, those black, endless eyes, locked onto him, dragging him deeper into their abyss. "Henry," she whispered, her voice laced with a sickening sweetness. "You think you can leave, don't you? You think you can run. But you're already here. You belong here now." He wanted to scream, wanted to call for help, but his throat was tight, as though an invisible hand was choking him. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The shadows, once distant, were now alive, crawling along the floor, curling up the walls like tendrils. They seemed to whisper, though no words were spoken, just a constant hum, a vibration that seeped into his bones. The woman's laugh echoed through the room, the sound sharp and jagged, like glass shattering. "You've been marked," she hissed, and then in an instant she was gone. Disappeared. Vanished into thin air. Henry's heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't know what to do. The air around him felt thick, as if the house itself was holding him in place, trapping him with no way out. He spun around, his eyes frantically searching for any escape, any hint of a way out. That's when he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow passing through the corner of his eye. He whipped his head around, but there was nothing there. His mind raced, trying to grasp at the fading remnants of the woman's presence, trying to understand what had just happened. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the other side of the room. The floorboards groaned beneath something heavy, and then something scraped against the walls, sharp and grating. It sounded like claws, long and ragged, dragging along the wood. "Who's there?" Henry managed to choke out, his voice cracking. There was no answer. Only the sound of his own breathing, now rapid and shallow. His eyes locked onto the staircase leading up to the second floor. The shadows there were thick, dark as night, and something seemed to be moving within them, shifting. Henry couldn't explain it, but he could feel the presence there. It was watching him. He wasn't alone in this house. He took a slow, cautious step toward the stairs, his pulse racing in his ears. As his foot landed on the first step, a sharp sound echoed through the house, like the creak of a door opening. His heart skipped a beat. Something was down there, something that didn't want him to reach the stairs. And then, as though in answer, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, his face pale, his eyes hollow and empty. He stood motionless, his body still as a statue, but his presence felt like a weight that pressed down on Henry's chest. The man didn't move, didn't speak. But Henry could see the darkness in his eyes, a void so deep that it felt like the man was no longer human. "Who are you?" Henry whispered, stepping back, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, almost curiously, as if Henry's fear intrigued him. A low growl rumbled from the corner of the room, and Henry's head snapped toward it. Another figure emerged from the shadows. This one was smaller, hunched, its limbs twisted and broken. It crawled toward him on all fours, its body contorting unnaturally as if it had never known the shape of a human being. Henry stumbled backward, his heart racing, his body trembling with terror. These weren't just people, they were something else. Something ancient. Something evil. The man's mouth stretched into a smile, a grin that shouldn't have been possible for a human face. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice cold and hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth. "This town is ours." And then, with a sudden movement, the man lunged at him. Henry barely had time to react. He bolted toward the door, his hands trembling as he yanked on the handle. But the door wouldn't open. It was locked. The house itself was keeping him inside, trapping him in its nightmarish grip. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, growing louder and louder. There was nowhere to go. No way out. He turned to face the man, but he was gone. Vanished. Just like the woman. It was as though they had never been there at all. But then the growl came again. The creature that had been crawling on the floor was now standing before him, its twisted body hunched and grotesque. Its eyes gleamed in the dark, its mouth dripping with something foul. "Leave now," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Before it's too late." Henry's blood ran cold. He didn't understand. What was going on in this town? Why were these things here? And why did they want him to leave? It didn't make sense. The creature reached out a clawed hand, its fingers elongating like spindly branches. "You can't leave," it said, its voice full of malice. "You're already part of us." Suddenly, Henry realized something terrifying. He wasn't just trapped in the house. He was trapped in the town itself. These things weren't just after him, they were after everyone. And he wasn't sure if he could escape. But one thing was certain. There was no one left to help. As Henry stumbled backward, the walls of the house seemed to close in on him. The floor beneath his feet began to shift, the wood cracking and groaning as if the house itself was alive, feeding on his fear. He had to escape. He had to leave before it was too late. But the house had other plans. Henry's legs shook beneath him as he stumbled backward, away from the creature that stood before him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, every inch of him screaming to flee, but the walls of the house seemed to close in tighter with each passing second, the air thick with a sinister presence that gripped his chest. The creature, its mouth still dripping with that black, foul substance, began to creep forward, its body bending and twisting in unnatural angles. Its eyes, those dark, empty voids, bore into Henry, freezing him in place as if its gaze alone could paralyze him. "You're not leaving," it whispered, its voice low and rasping, like a broken record playing through static. "Not ever." Henry's heart pounded so violently he feared it might burst from his chest. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape this house, this nightmare, but the door, still locked, still impenetrable, mocked him, trapping him in this suffocating cage. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle again, but it didn't budge. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They grew louder, closer, like a predator stalking its prey. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the dark hallway that led to the stairs. The shadows there seemed to move, shifting in ways they shouldn't, as if something, or someone, was lurking in the corners, watching. A voice broke the silence. "Henry," it was a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. The hairs on the back of Henry's neck stood up. It was a voice he hadn't heard before. The tone was low and gravelly, as if it had been buried deep underground for years, echoing from a place far beyond the physical world. He turned quickly, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the shadows. Watching. "Who's there?" Henry called out, his voice trembling with fear. but the only reply was a chilling silence. The footsteps from above had stopped. And then an unmistakable noise. The creak of a floorboard. Henry spun around, eyes wide with terror. The thing that had been crawling toward him now loomed above him, its twisted limbs reaching out like some ancient, horrifying thing from a forgotten legend. Its breath, if it could even be called that, was foul, a rancid stench that clawed at his lungs. It had moved closer without him even noticing, and now it was standing directly in front of him. No, no. Henry gasped, stumbling backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He crashed to the ground, the air knocked from his lungs. The creature's twisted face twisted into a grin, its black, soulless eyes gleaming with malice. "You can't escape," it repeated, this time more forcefully, its voice rising in pitch. "You belong to us now. You're part of this place." Henry scrambled to his feet, panic threatening to overwhelm him. He glanced wildly around, searching for any escape, any way out. The walls seemed to close in, the room itself warping and bending like it was alive. The house, the town, it was all a trap. And there was no escape. The figure loomed closer, and as it did, something strange happened. A deep, rumbling noise vibrated through the floor, the walls, the entire house. It was as though the house itself was coming alive, its foundation shifting beneath them. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and pulse, a grotesque form of life that rippled with dark energy. Then the air grew colder. Henry could feel it biting at his skin, seeping into his very bones. He shuddered, his teeth chattering. "That's just the beginning," the creature hissed. "There's no going back now. The house has chosen you. And it always gets what it wants." The room seemed to shift again. The walls no longer felt like mere barriers, they felt like breathing entities, pulsating with an almost predatory hunger. Henry could feel the weight of their gaze as though the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to falter, so it could devour him. And then he heard something else. A low, guttural whisper that came from every direction at once. "Help, help us." The voice was broken, desperate, pleading. It came from somewhere deep within the house, beneath the floorboards, within the walls. It echoed in his mind, clawing at his sanity, like a sickening chant that wouldn't let go. Henry's chest tightened with terror, his stomach churning. The air was thick with a presence so oppressive, so suffocating, that it was as though the very atmosphere was alive and pressing in on him from all sides. "Who's there?" Henry shouted, his voice cracking with fear. And then, as if in response, a new sound began to fill the room, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails dragging across wood. The noise was faint at first, but it grew louder, growing in intensity, coming from all directions, surrounding him. He spun in a circle, his mind reeling. The sound was everywhere now, each tap making his skin crawl, his heart race faster, his breath come in shallow gasps. It was as if something was coming for him. No, someone. Someone who had been waiting in the shadows all along. The tapping stopped suddenly. Dead silence. For a moment, Henry stood frozen, barely able to breathe, afraid that if he moved, whatever was lurking in the dark would come rushing for him. The air around him grew heavier, colder. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure appeared. It was a woman. She stood motionless, her long hair hanging in front of her face, obscuring her features. Her skin was pale, almost lifeless, as though she had been dead for years. Yet her eyes, those eyes, were alive, wild, filled with madness. "Help me," she whispered, her voice rasping as though it had not been used in years. "They're coming." The floor beneath Henry's feet trembled as if the house itself was shaking in response to her words. The shadows shifted, growing darker, thicker, as if feeding off her fear, her desperation. Henry could feel it. The weight. The presence. It was too much to bear. The woman took a step forward. And then another. "Run," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll take you too." But before Henry could move, before he could even react, the figure lunged at him, her hands reaching for his throat, her mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. "No. Get away from me," Henry shouted, flinging himself backward, his body crashing against the wall. The room spun, and for a moment, everything went black. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, his hands gripping the edge of the floor as his vision blurred. His pulse throbbed in his ears, and a cold sweat drenched his skin. The house seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing down like they were alive, suffocating him with a crushing weight. His eyes darted around the room, but everything was shrouded in darkness, except for the faint, flickering glow coming from the far corner, where the woman had stood just moments before. But now she was gone. The only sound was the echo of his own rapid breathing and the low, creaking groan of the old house. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, his knees threatening to buckle. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, the events unfolding too fast for him to comprehend. Every step he took felt like he was walking through thick, invisible fog, the air suffocating and stifling. What was happening? Help! Help us! The voice whispered again, only now it seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding him. It was like a chorus of voices trapped in the house, all pleading for salvation. The words slithered through the air, crawling under his skin and burrowing deep into his mind. Henry shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't. The floor beneath him suddenly groaned, a low rumble like the earth itself was shifting. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The creaking noise grew louder, like something massive was moving in the darkness just beyond his sight. Henry's breath hitched, his body frozen in place as the room seemed to expand and contract with every sound. His eyes widened with terror. Something was coming. He could feel it. The house had become something else, something not human. Its very presence felt wrong, alive in a way that twisted and corrupted everything it touched. Every step he took seemed to draw him deeper into its clutches. The whispers were growing louder, more frantic, as if they were urging him forward, pulling him toward the center of the house where something waited. The floor shifted again. Henry's eyes snapped to the far corner where a soft light flickered. He felt drawn to it, though every instinct in him screamed to turn and run. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know what was happening. The room seemed to twist around him, the walls warping in and out of focus as though they were breathing. When he reached the corner, his eyes widened with horror. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned mirror. It was cracked in places, the glass shattered, but the reflection that stared back at him wasn't his own. Instead, it was a figure, dark and shrouded in shadow. Its face was obscured, but Henry could feel its eyes upon him, even though he couldn't see them. The figure seemed to be reaching out, its hand hovering just inches from the glass, as if it were trying to touch him, pull him in. The whispering voices grew louder, more urgent, filling his head with maddening chants. Help us, save us. Henry's pulse quickened. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, his breath becoming shallow, erratic. The air felt thick with the weight of the house, and the presence of the figure in the mirror seemed to grow more powerful with every passing second. Suddenly, the room went silent. For a long, dreadful moment, there was no sound at all. The whispers stopped. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the glass in the mirror shattered completely, sending shards flying across the room with a deafening crack. Henry stumbled backward, his hands shooting up to shield his face as glass splintered and rained down. But there was no time to react. He felt it then, a cold, clammy hand wrap around his wrist, its fingers digging into his skin like talons. The touch was icy, unnatural, sending a jolt of terror through his body. He spun around, but no one was there. The hand had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the fading sensation of its grip. Before he could process what had just happened, the house seemed to shift again. The air grew colder, much colder. The temperature plummeted so quickly that he could see his breath fogging in front of him, despite it being a warm night only moments ago. Something was coming. The shadows on the wall seemed to grow thicker, stretching toward him like fingers trying to grasp him, to pull him into their depths. And then, the floorboards beneath his feet began to creak again. Slowly, methodically, step by step. A figure emerged from the shadows, its shape barely visible, but it was unmistakable. It was tall, too tall, and it moved unnaturally, bending and twisting in ways no human body could. It was an impossible silhouette, something from beyond this world, something that shouldn't exist. The whispers grew louder, rising to a fever pitch as the figure moved toward Henry. His heart raced in his chest, every muscle in his body frozen with fear. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. "You belong to us now," the voice hissed, and this time, it came from the figure itself. The words reverberated through the air, making Henry's skin crawl, his entire body trembling with fear. The creature's outline became clearer, more distinct. Its face was twisted, a grotesque mask of shadows and jagged features. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty, hollow, like dark voids that threatened to consume everything they touched. Henry tried to back away, but the floor beneath him gave way. He screamed as he fell into the abyss, the darkness swallowing him whole. He tried to reach for something, anything to stop his descent, but there was nothing. He was falling deeper and deeper into the house, into the black void that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers surrounded him, their voices echoing in his ears, calling his name. Then a voice, familiar yet distant, cut through the chaos. "Henry?" He stopped falling, suspended in the darkness. The air was thick, suffocating, but the voice continued. "Henry, you have to escape." The voice grew fainter, the darkness pressing in closer. "Henry?" And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The room returned to silence. Henry blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, but there was nothing there. No creature. No whispering voices. Just the stillness of the house. What was happening? The unease was overwhelming. The house wasn't done with him. It was just toying with him, making him believe he had a chance to escape. But Henry knew deep down, there was no escaping it. There was no escaping what the house wanted. And the house wanted him. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. The voice, the creature, the darkness, it was all connected. The house was alive, and it would do whatever it took to trap him, to keep him here forever. But just as he thought it might be over, just as he started to breathe again, something else happened. A soft, gentle sound, like the tap of fingers on glass, echoed from the walls around him. Then the floor beneath him cracked open. The cold, suffocating silence pressed against Henry's ears as he lay flat on his back. His body felt weightless, suspended in the air, but his mind was racing. The crack in the floor beneath him had opened up like a wound, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to devour all the light around him. But there was no escape, no way out. He tried to move, to force his limbs into action, but his body refused to cooperate. Every attempt felt like wading through a sea of thick, viscous tar, each second longer than the last. The very air around him felt like it was choking him, as if the house itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him slowly. Henry knew the truth now. There was no escaping. The house had claimed him. And then a sound. A whisper, just above the sound of his own breathing. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was enough to freeze him in place. "Henry?" His heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, but twisted, distorted. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. He could feel the icy fingers of dread creeping up his spine, each word sinking deeper into his mind, infecting it with terror. The shadows around him seemed to move, twisting like living creatures, writhing and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The whispers grew louder, now all speaking in unison, chanting his name, urging him forward into the darkness. "Henry, Henry, Henry?" He looked around, but there was nothing, only shadows and silence. But the air was thick with something else, something darker. His eyes snapped to the crack in the floor, the abyss that yawned open before him. Something was calling from within. The floor shifted again, the edges of the crack expanding, pulling wider, wider still, until the entire room felt like it was collapsing around him. The walls trembled, the house groaning in agony, and Henry's heart thundered in his chest as the pull of the void seemed to reach for him, beckoning him closer, closer to the edge. Then the voice again. Louder this time, its tone twisted and almost mocking. "Do you think you can run?" it hissed. "Do you think you can escape?" Henry's stomach lurched as the temperature around him plummeted, his breath becoming visible in the frozen air. He could feel it now, the cold, the presence of something ancient and vile that had been waiting for him. Something that had always been there, lurking, watching him, waiting for the right moment to claim him. "Henry," the voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. Something alive, something that wasn't human. The air around him thickened, buzzing with a faint electrical hum. And then, as the darkness swallowed him whole, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. It was something else. Something older. Something that didn't belong in this world. Its shape shifted in the shadows as if it could be anything, anyone. Its eyes glowed a faint, sickly green, and as it stepped closer to him, the room seemed to contract, suffocating him with its presence. Henry tried to scream, but no sound came from his lips. His mouth opened, but the air was too thick to push anything out. His breath came in ragged gasps as he felt the figure's cold touch on his face, the icy fingers dragging down his cheek, leaving behind a trail of burning, unnatural cold. "No, not now. Not like this." His eyes filled with tears as the figure leaned in closer, its grotesque face only inches from his own. The eyes, those soulless, empty eyes, seemed to pierce through him into the very core of his being. "You belong to me now," it whispered. Suddenly, the house shook, the entire structure groaning as if it were alive, as if it had felt the figure's presence and was responding to it. The air crackled with an electric charge, and Henry felt a pressure building around him, squeezing the life from him, suffocating him. But just as he thought the end had come, just as he thought the darkness would swallow him whole, a scream shattered the silence. A scream that wasn't his own. It echoed through the house, rattling the walls, shaking the very foundation beneath him. Henry's head whipped around, his eyes searching desperately for the source of the scream. But there was nothing. No one. And then the floor beneath him cracked open even wider. Henry's eyes widened in terror as a hand reached up from the depths of the void. Long, skeletal fingers, pale and claw-like, stretched toward him, dragging themselves up from the abyss, the nails scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The air around him grew colder, the temperature plunging to unthinkable depths as the hand continued to rise, dragging itself closer to him. And then the whispers grew louder, too loud. They echoed in his ears, each word a scream of torment. Henry. Henry. The hand was almost there now, the fingers brushing the edges of his feet. He could feel the chill radiating from it, the unnatural cold that seemed to freeze his very soul. He wanted to move, wanted to run, but his body was paralyzed, frozen by fear. The fingers brushed against his skin. It was too late. With a deafening crack, the house seemed to implode in on itself. The walls, the floor, everything around Henry shattered in an explosion of debris. The darkness consumed him, pulling him into the void, the whispers now deafening, clawing at his sanity. And then, silence. Everything stopped. For a moment, Henry's mind was blank. Empty. He couldn't feel anything. He couldn't hear anything. Just the stillness of the void. And then a voice, familiar yet distant, cut through the silence. Henry, you thought you were the one in control? The voice laughed, cold, mocking, and terrifying, and the last thing Henry heard was the voice whispering, "You're already too late." But was he? Or was this just the beginning?